Georg Lukács's The Theory of the Novel is a meditation on the evolution and nature of the novel, written against the backdrop of a world on the cusp of dramatic transformation. Emerging from the intellectual milieu of Central Europe in the early 20th century, a time when Marxism, psychoanalysis, and existentialism were beginning to shape the contours of modern thought, Lukács's work is a critical reflection on the historical conditions that gave rise to the novel as a distinct literary form, one that embodies the complexities and contradictions of modernity itself. Composed in 1914 to 1915, first published in 1920, and available in Anna Bostock's English translation, the book situates the novel not as a technical craft, so much as the privileged aesthetic expression of a world in which the old, immediate unity between self and world has broken apart. Conceived amid the upheaval of the First World War, the essay bears the imprint of that crisis and the period's radical debates, in the company of works such as Rosa Luxemburg's Spartacus Letters, Lenin's Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, and Spengler's Decline of the West. Lukács's analysis grows out of a philosophical lineage that includes Kant, Hegel, and Marx, as well as the existential and sociological analyses of Kierkegaard, Simmel, Weber, and Husserl. This inheritance informs his account of the novel's historical development and anchors it within the era's broader cultural and philosophical disorientation. Lukács's work marks a pivotal transition in his own intellectual journey as he moves from the Kantian framework of his early writings toward a Hegelian dialectic that will prepare his later commitment to Marxism-Leninism. This transition shapes his understanding of the novel as a historically situated form that emerges with the disintegration of a worldview once experienced as harmonious and integrated. In the classical epic, he argues, individual action possessed cosmic resonance. Soul and world, interiority and exteriority had not yet drifted apart. By contrast, the novel arises from what Lukács calls a condition of transcendental homelessness, characteristic of modernity, a world in which meaning is no longer immanent to life, where the individual feels estranged from both self and world, and where totality appears as a problematic, fragmented horizon rather than a given order. This homelessness names not a passing mood, but a structural predicament of the modern subject, and the search for meaning under such conditions becomes the novel's distinctive task. In this perspective, Lukács traces a long development from epic to romance and then to the realist novel, each phase intensifying the felt disjunction between person and world. The novel thus becomes the form par excellence for articulating fragmentation and disillusionment, while sustaining an inquiry into how meaning might still be sought without presupposing a ready-made unity. The Theory of the Novel, a historico-philosophical essay on the forms of great epic literature, is at once a morphology of narrative form, a philosophy of cultural epochs, and a diagnosis of modern estrangement. In Lukács's determination, the novel emerges where epic wholeness can no longer be lived and where tragedy, though surviving in altered guise, can no longer mediate life's essence as it once did. The form internalizes historical fracture and translates it into a poetics of seeking, irony, and ethically burdened composition. The treatise unfolds in conscious relation to its historical conjuncture. In his preface, Lukács evokes a vehement global rejection of war, the shock of the European left's crisis in 1914, and his methodical pivot from a Kantian stance to Hegelian categories under the pressure of events. Formed within the Geisteswissenschaften, Dilthey, Simmel, Max Weber. He turns to Hegel's historicized logic of forms to grasp why certain genres are possible or impossible at specific moments in the life of spirit. In a later preface, 1962, he acknowledges both the strengths and limits of this approach. Though prone at times to abstraction, it was among the first to apply Hegelian insights concretely to aesthetics, especially to the dialectic of epic, tragedy, and novel as epochal articulations of the relation between form and world. Where Hegel suggests art becomes problematic once reality attains reconciliation, Lukács inverts the direction. The novel's problems mirror a reality gone out of joint, a world no longer sustained by an unbroken experiential totality. The book's judgments are therefore ethical as well as formal. The argument begins by distinguishing integrated civilizations from problematic ones. In the former, emblematic of Homeric Greece, answers precede questions. Self and world are bounded yet homogeneous. Action yields complete deeds, whose meaning resides within the life world itself. Such a world can bear epic because the metaphysical ground of experience is shared and evident, rendering philosophy unnecessary in the modern sense. The Greek spirit, Lukács famously writes, knew only answers but no questions, which explains the inimitable perfection of Homer and the gulf that separates our epic from theirs. This is not nostalgia, but a mapping of transcendental loci, a world where knowledge unveils what is already there, creation imitates eternal essences, and virtue is a knowledge of paths can sustain epic totality. Once that ancient circle breaks, the modern world lacks any spontaneously given totality. Spirit must produce forms. They no longer unfold as transparent emanations of a shared substance, but require active construction. The gap between cognition and action, soul and structure, self and world, becomes bridgeable only through stylization. Art detaches from life as a created totality, a second nature wrought against the fragmentary first. This loss of immanent meaning changes not only the artist's means, but the ontology of genres. Tragedy can persist, though bifurcated in modernity, the Shakespearean ingestion of life versus the Alfierian abstraction, because its object is essence. Epic cannot. Its object is life, and when life no longer bears its meanings within itself, epic yields to a form that must make totality an aim rather than a datum, hence the novel. Here lies the pivot of Lukács's aesthetics of form. Epic presupposes a prior congruence of soul and world. Drama presupposes the intensive totality of essence. The novel alone must navigate a world whose totality is not given, but must be constructed from heterogeneous elements. Correspondingly, the temporality proper to the novel incorporates lived duration among its constitutive principles, not merely chronological measure, but inner time through which meaning is sought, deferred, and, if at all, provisionally achieved. With this ontological displacement comes a new anthropology of the hero. In epic and tragedy, crime and madness function as symbolic moments through which destiny manifests an already immanent essence. In the novel, they become signs of homelessness, action's homelessness in the human order and the soul's homelessness among suprapersonal values. The novelistic subject is a seeker. Seeking itself becomes the structural principle that announces the lack of any immediately adequate object. Goals and paths cannot be presupposed. Vocation may be indistinguishable from monomania. The form thus begins with the indeterminacy of ethical orientation and the tentativeness of normativity. The hero seeks a totality that no longer surrounds him and must attempt to produce it through life. Lukács reconstructs the novel's inner architecture as fundamentally abstract yet processual, an edifice composed of quasi-autonomous parts whose relations are never organically guaranteed but must be forged. The danger is evident. Where ethical substance is not given a priori in life's institutions, a work may project only a subjective aspect of totality, rather than an existent whole. To withstand this, the novel depends on tact and taste, categories ordinarily subordinate to ethical world orders, elevated here to constitutive functions. Only they can equilibrate subjectivity and posit epically normative objectivity, surmounting the abstraction endemic to the form. The task is not to suppress subjectivity, which would be still more abstract, but to bring it to self-recognition and self-abolition. Lukács calls this movement irony. Irony serves both cognition and composition. It is the self-correction of the world's fragility. The novelist recognizes the mutual limitations of inner and outer as conditions of their existence and, renouncing satiric superiority, applies a free irony to the self as much as to the characters. The result is a purely formal unity attained within essential antagonism, a unity that never cancels duality but gives it a composed shape as a totality repeatedly risked and re-achieved. Composition thus becomes the paradoxical labor of fusing contingent, discrete elements into a whole whose unity depends on an ethic of self-surmounting reflection. The loss of epic immediacy entails a new affect. Objectivity must be won a second time by an equilibrium of reflections that rounds the form while signaling the sacrifice that makes it possible. This ethic of composition determines the repertoire of representation. Because parts are more independent than in the epic, they must be inscribed architecturally. Novellas that illuminate a central problem, preludes that plant latent motifs whose force only becomes visible retrospectively. Don Quixote supplies the paradigmatic case. Its interpolated tales are not ornament, but structural spotlights that refract the total problem. In such architectures, meaning arises not from a given organic life, but from a conceptual ordering that must again and again integrate what it surpasses. Lukács offers a typology that indexes how soul and world are mediated. The first great type, abstract idealism, is embodied in Don Quixote. Interiority confronts a prosaic world that cannot validate its ideals, yet the confrontation allows interiority not merely to survive, but to irradiate its opponent with poetic afterlight. The danger is trivialization, falling into mere entertainment or schematic idealism severed from a true world of ideas. That Don Quixote remains singular illustrates both the potential and the peril of a form whose transcendental tension cannot be duplicated at will. A related variant, the demonic narrowing of the soul, receives exemplary treatment in Lukács's reading of Pontypriddin's Hans im Glück. Unlike Quixote's positive, dynamic demonic, an inner certainty that compels adventures by its own logic, Pontypriddin's hero negates each empirical success as inessential, progressively purifying the self until resignation becomes the retrospective immanence that confers meaning. The irony lies in the protagonist's continual successes, each jettisoned under an invisible compulsion, so that only the ending reconstitutes the narrative as coherent destiny. The action appears in retrospect as a sequence of veils removed from a soul that had remained constant. The second major type, the romanticism of disillusionment, reverses the polarity. The hero is contemplative. Failure becomes the price of interior magnitude. The aesthetic problem is acute. How to translate hesitancy or rhapsodic inwardness into epic action without collapsing into lyric. The mood is structurally ambivalent, love and accusation, pity and scorn, and the ethical pathos derives from the conviction that defeat is inscribed in the self's finest striving. Here, time assumes a new weight, not a measure framing deeds, but duration through which possibility decays into memory and desire. To avoid formlessness, the novel must find compositional means to make temporal loss legible without reducing it to private lament. Between these types stands Goethe's Wilhelm Meister as an attempted synthesis. The novel of education, Bildungsroman, presupposes neither the futility of heroic action nor the sanctification of resignation, but the possibility of mediated reconciliation through a community of action. Its confidence derives from relativizing the hero's centrality. The Tower archives many apprenticeships, not merely Wilhelm's, and from positing that individual formation and social forms can educate one another, even if the path entails error, compromise, and the loss of certain lives. Social life is objectified so that homecoming remains real, yet the writer must resist exchanging irony for unconditioned affirmation. The achieved harmony has the same ontological weight as prior phases of meaninglessness. Lifting it above the world's opacity would endanger the work's unity. Hence, Lukács notes the temptation in romantic treatments to romanticize reality into a sphere free of problems, a temptation the Bildungsroman must continually withstand.
These analyses intensify the book's foundational claim about the novel's inner form. Because unity is not guaranteed, composition is an ongoing risk of losing unity in the very act of constituting it. The novelist's ethic is double: to give form to what happens to an idea in life, and to give form to the destiny of this very reflection within the narrator. The reflection must itself become object, undergo a fate, and be ethically corrected. Irony mediates between these tasks, becoming the work's normative mentality. From here, Lukács' distinctions about medium and material assume their full force. Verse and prose are not neutral vehicles, but condensed ontologies. Where epic verse presupposes a world already whole, prose marks a world in which totality becomes labor. Correlatively, the novel's world consists of objective structures whose normativity is undecidable in advance. Whether an institution, vocation, or relation can host meaningful action depends on its encounter with a subject for whom no structural guarantee can be given. For this reason, the novel of education especially requires an ironic affirmation that allows structures to appear independent of subjective wishes while still serving as occasions for meaningful formation. If homecoming occurs, it remains within reality's obstinacy and never floats free into myth.
The Historico-Philosophical section names the deeper stakes. The novel is the form of homelessness. Unlike epic or non-problematic tragedy, it cannot rest on a metaphysically integrated world. Its compositions must register directional lack. The demonic names the compulsions, negative or positive, that arise where neither nature nor society provides an evident measure. Pushed to its limit, irony approaches a formal mysticism, an intimation of unity without immanent completion, a posture of equanimity before permanent duality. The novel's greatness lies in transfiguring this homelessness into a legible, ethically serious order without lie or despair. The final horizon is programmatic. Tolstoy appears as the writer who, at the peak of realism, seeks to reach beyond the social forms of life, making the novel a polemic against convention, by retrieving nature as normative countermeasure, an operation as generative as it is perilous in a differentiated society. Dostoevsky is adduced as an outlook, a polyphonic spiritual drama that strains the novel's social ontologies and marks a threshold at which the form, as Lukács defines its historical vocation, gives way to another order for which his book offers orientation rather than closure. Read as an aesthetic logic of epics, the theory of the novel achieves three things at once. It reframes genre as the precipitate of a civilization's metaphysical structure. Epic with integrated orders, tragedy with the intensive life of essence at the point of detachment, the novel with the project of constructing totality in a problematic world. It canonicalizes the novel's inner principles, seeking, lived duration, architectural composition, irony, as necessities that follow from brokenness. And it links the hero's interiority to the world's capacities, abstract idealism, too narrow or too broad, disillusioned romanticism, subjectivity premised on defeat, and the educational synthesis, mediated reconciliation through community, along with the characteristic dangers of each, trivialization, formlessness, romanticizing.